Dylan had always been meticulous, his life a carefully arranged puzzle. Each piece placed with precision to maintain the illusion of normalcy. In his hometown, a buttoned-up Texas suburb where conformity was currency, he had mastered the art of omission. He dated girls when it was expected, laughed at the right jokes, nodded along when his relatives spoke of future wives and family legacies. But beneath the polished exterior, a different. Moving to Seattle had been a quiet act of rebellion, a chance to breathe in a city where no one knew him, where his every action wasn't catalogued for small-town gossip. Here, he could entertain the idea of authenticity, albeit from a safe distance. Dating apps became his clandestine escape, a world of flickering screens and blurred profile pictures where he could tiptoe toward the truth without consequence. But even there, he was cautious. No real names, no face photos, just a faceless torso and a carefully vague bio. He told himself he wasn't hiding, just waiting. Waiting for the day when the risk of being seen wouldn't feel like standing on the edge of a cliff. Jack's arrival was supposed to be inconsequential, a blip in Dylan's otherwise controlled existence. When his younger cousin called about an internship in Seattle and asked if he could stay for the summer, Dylan agreed out of familial obligation, expecting little more than polite cohabitation. He pictured Jack as he had always been, the lanky, excitable kid from family gatherings, more interested in video games and pickup basketball than anything resembling deep conversation. But the Jack who stepped through Dylan's doorway that June evening was someone else entirely. Broad-shouldered and self-assured, he carried himself with an ease that Dylan had yet to master. An effortless charisma that filled the apartment in a way Dylan hadn't anticipated. "Man, this place is great," Jack said, dropping his duffel bag and flashing a grin that was all confidence and familiarity. Dylan nodded, offering a distracted, "Yeah." But his mind was already recalibrating, adjusting to the unsettling realization that Jack was no longer just a younger cousin passing through. He was a presence. Their routines quickly settled into a rhythm. Jack spent long days at his internship, returning late with stories of corporate chaos and happy hour mishaps. Dylan, meanwhile, found himself hyper-aware of his every move. His private world suddenly too small for two. His carefully curated solitude had been disrupted. And worse, he couldn't quite bring himself to mind. Because as much as Jack's presence unsettled him, it also intrigued him. And Dylan, for all his caution, had never been one to ignore intrigue. The illusion of control shattered on a random Tuesday evening. Dylan had assumed Jack would be out, another late night of networking and overpriced cocktails with his intern friends, so he let himself relax. Sprawled across the couch, absent-mindedly scrolling through profiles on his phone. It was a quiet indulgence, a ritual of anonymity he had perfected over the years. No faces, no real names, just glimpses of possibility behind carefully curated masks. But when the apartment door swung open unexpectedly, panic surged through him. In his haste to exit the app, his fingers fumbled, and the phone slipped from his grasp, landing screen up on the couch. A neon blue notification banner flashed across the screen, a name unmistakable to anyone even remotely familiar with the world of queer dating. Dylan barely had time to grab for it before Jack's gaze landed on the screen. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Dylan's stomach twisted, already bracing for whatever came next. A joke? A dismissive comment? A crack in the thin ice he'd been treading his entire life? But Jack just arched an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his expression. "Didn't think you'd be on there," he said, voice even, unreadable. Dylan's mouth went dry. He wasn't sure what defense he was reaching for. But before he could form one, Jack smirked and, with a casual shrug, added, "Guess that makes two of us." And just like that, the ground beneath Dylan shifted, the world rearranging itself in a way he hadn't seen coming. For the first time in his life, Dylan wasn't alone in this. The realization settled somewhere deep, an unfamiliar weight that felt equal parts relief and unease. Jack, his cousin, the same Jack he had spent years regarding as nothing more than a distant family fixture, was on the same side of a battle Dylan had been fighting in silence. And now, the silence had cracked. At first, their conversations were cautious, circling the topic like it was a live wire neither of them was quite ready to touch. It started with vague, unspoken acknowledgments, an offhand comment about a mutual frustration with family expectations. A casual joke about dodging questions at holiday gatherings. But soon, the words came more freely. Late at night, over takeout containers and half-empty beer bottles, they peeled back layers Dylan hadn't even realized he was wearing. Jack talked about the double life he had been leading, open with friends at college but stepping back into the closet every time he set foot at home. Dylan shared his own carefully constructed world, the years of avoidance, the exhausting effort of keeping his true self quarantined from his family. And somewhere in those quiet conversations, something shifted. The distance between them, once defined by childhood memories and family ties, blurred into something else, something built on understanding, shared experience, and the quiet, unspoken recognition of two people who had spent too long pretending. For the first time in years, Dylan felt seen, and that, more than anything, terrified him. It started as a suggestion, half a joke, half a reckless idea tossed into the air between them. They had been talking about dating. About the awkwardness of first encounters. The uncertainty of attraction when you'd never been allowed to practice wanting. Jack had laughed, leaning back against the couch, his beer dangling loosely in his hand. "You know," he mused, "we could just help each other out." Dylan had blinked at him, unsure if he had misheard. Help each other out? Jack shrugged, suddenly more interested in peeling the label off his bottle. "I mean, think about it. Neither of us has much experience. Right? We know we're into guys. But we've spent so much time hiding it. We haven't actually done much about it. What if we practiced? No pressure. No expectations. Just a safe space to figure things out." Dylan should have shut it down immediately. He should have laughed, brushed it off, let the moment slip away like any other absurd late-night thought. But instead, he found himself considering it. The logic was undeniable. Who else could understand the hesitancy? The fear? The need for control over something that had always felt out of reach? "Just once," he said finally, testing the words as they left his mouth. Jack nodded, watching him carefully. Just once. But as Dylan would soon realize, nothing about this would stay that simple. Once a line is crossed, no matter how carefully, there's no way to pretend it never existed. They told themselves it was just practice, just a way to ease into something that had always felt impossible. And in the beginning, it almost was. The first kiss was tentative, barely more than a brush of lips. Both of them too hyper-aware of what they were doing to let it feel natural. But then, somewhere along the way, restraint gave way to curiosity. Curiosity gave way to familiarity. And familiarity? That was dangerous. Dylan had always believed that attraction was something he could compartmentalize. Something that existed in a neat, controlled space. But nothing about this felt controlled. Not when Jack's laughter filled the apartment in the late hours of the night. Warm and unguarded. Not when their casual touches, an arm draped over the back of the couch, a hand brushing against a wrist, lingered just a second too long. Not when Dylan started to crave those moments. When he caught himself looking at Jack in ways he had no business looking at him. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a set of unspoken rules neither of them would break. But the rules were shifting, blurring under the weight of something neither of them wanted to name. Dylan knew they were walking a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But every time Jack looked at him like that, like there was something here neither of them had planned for, he couldn't bring himself to care. Because the truth was, Dylan didn't just want the practice anymore. He wanted Jack, and that was the real problem. The shift was subtle at first, so small that Dylan almost convinced himself he was imagining it. Jack spent more nights out, came home later, talked about the people he was meeting in casual, throwaway comments that shouldn't have made Dylan's stomach twist the way they did. And yet, they did, every time. Then came the day Jack mentioned an actual date. Not just drinks with intern friends. Not just scrolling through profiles for the sake of it. But a real, intentional date. "I matched with someone," he said over breakfast, voice deliberately casual. "Meeting up for coffee this weekend." Dylan froze for half a second before forcing himself to keep stirring his coffee. "That's great," he said, hating how hollow the words sounded. That was kind of the point of all this, right? Jack hesitated, like he was waiting for Dylan to say something else, something honest. But Dylan didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he nodded, as if this was all perfectly normal. As if it didn't feel like the ground beneath him was quietly shifting. That night, lying in bed, Dylan stared at the ceiling and tried to untangle the mess of emotions knotted inside him. Jealousy? Maybe, but it was deeper than that. It wasn't just that Jack was meeting someone. It was the realization that, despite everything, Dylan had never truly considered the possibility of this ending. That, for all his careful boundaries, he had let himself want something he had no right to claim. Jack's date came and went, and life should have continued as usual. But it didn't. Something had shifted, an invisible fault line running between them, too small to name but impossible to ignore. Dylan told himself it was nothing, just a natural transition back to reality. The problem was, reality felt unbearable. Jack didn't talk much about the date, just mentioned that it was fine, before disappearing into his room. Dylan wanted to leave it at that, but the silence between them was heavier than before, filled with words neither of them wanted to be the first to say. The tension only grew in the following days, Jack spending more time out, Dylan throwing himself into work, both of them pretending they weren't aware of the growing space between them. Then, one evening, Jack sighed and set his beer down with just a little too much force. "Are we gonna talk about this?" Dylan kept his gaze on the TV, the moving images blurring into nothing. "Talk about what?" Jack let out a humorless laugh. "Right, because that's what we do." "Huh? Pretend things don't exist?" Dylan swallowed. "I don't know what you want me to say." Jack turned to face him fully, his voice quieter now, steadier. "I think you do." And Dylan did. He knew exactly what Jack was asking, what they had been circling for weeks now. But to say it out loud? That would mean there was no turning back. And Dylan wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The morning Jack left, the apartment felt unbearably empty before he was even gone. His bags were packed neatly by the door, his keys resting on the kitchen counter. And yet it still didn't feel real. They had danced around this moment for days, avoiding the inevitable weight of goodbye, pretending that this was just another morning, just another summer day. But it wasn't. It was an ending, no matter how much they tried to convince themselves otherwise. Dylan stood by the doorway, hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching as Jack zipped up his duffel bag with practiced ease. "Call me when you get there," Dylan said, voice steady despite the tightness in high. Jack glanced up, his expression unreadable for a fraction of a second before it softened. "Yeah, of course." They lingered there, in that tense silence, no one moving, no one speaking, until finally, Jack took a step forward. And then another. And before Dylan could think, Jack's arms were around him, warm and strong and familiar. Dylan exhaled, letting himself sink into them, letting himself feel everything he was. Jack pulled back enough to look at him, his eyes searching. "This isn't over, you know." Dylan's breath hitched, but he nodded. "I know." And as Jack turned and walked out the door, Dylan told himself that it was true, that this wasn't the end, that maybe, somehow, the future would meet again.